You have been told that money follows hard work. Work harder, stay longer, do more, and the money will come. That is what school taught you. That is what your parents believed. That is what your boss implies every time he hands you a slightly bigger number on a slightly thinner piece of paper. And here is the thing. It is not wrong. Hard work does produce money. The problem is what happens to that money after it arrives, because nobody told you about that part. Nobody sat you down and explained what the people at the top actually do differently. Not what they earn, what they do. There is a gap between earning money and keeping money, between keeping money and growing money, between growing money and never worrying about money again. Most people live their entire lives inside that gap without knowing the gap exists. They work, they earn, they spend, they stress, they work harder, same result, and they quietly wonder what they are missing. You are not missing effort. You have plenty of that. What you are missing is 5 things. 5 specific ideas that the people building real wealth understand and almost never talk about out loud. Not because they are illegal, not because they are complicated, because silence is part of how they work. Why does telling people hurt your plan? Because the moment you say it out loud, your brain registers a small version of the reward before you have done anything. The telling feels like progress. It is not progress, it is the enemy of progress. The moment you announce what you are doing with your money, people have opinions. The moment you share your plan, someone talks you out of it. The moment you tell people you are thinking differently, they remind you to be realistic. So the people who figured this out stopped talking about it, and that silence became part of the strategy. What you are about to hear is not a get-rich-quick list. It is not a trick. It is not a loophole. It is 5 ideas explained clearly that most people will never hear because most people are surrounded by other people who do not know them either. Stay with this, because if you leave before the end, you will leave with the same map you came in with, and that map has not been working. Think about a bucket with a hole in the bottom. You pour water in from the top. You work hard pouring every day. More water, faster, but there is a hole, and the water is leaving almost as fast as it arrives. So you pour harder, longer hours, overtime, a second job, still the same level of water in the bucket. Most people's financial life looks exactly like that bucket. Money comes in at the top, salary, wages, income. Money leaves at the bottom, spending, interest payments, fees, tax, inflation quietly eating what is left, and the gap between what comes in and what stays, that gap is where your future lives or dies. Now here's what the people who figured this out understand. They stopped pouring harder first. They fixed the hole first. Not because they earned more, because they looked at the bucket differently. They asked a different question. Not, how do I earn more? But, where is the water actually going? And what they found when they looked, what they always find, is that the hole is not where they expected. It is not the big purchases. It is not the obvious things. It is the slow, quiet, invisible drain. The subscription nobody canceled. The interest rate nobody renegotiated. The tax structure nobody questioned. The habit nobody examined, drop by drop, every single day. For years, you do not feel a single drop leaving, but after 10 years, you feel the empty bucket. This video is about finding the holes, not pouring faster, because you have already proven you can pour. Here is something worth knowing. The system you grew up inside was not designed to make you wealthy. That is not a conspiracy. It is just a fact. Schools teach reading. Schools teach maths. Schools teach history and science and how to write an essay. What schools do not teach, have never taught, is how money actually moves, how it compounds, how it gets taxed, how it shifts from one person's pocket to another person's pocket while everyone calls it normal. The school curriculum in most countries was built during the industrial era. The goal was to produce reliable workers, people who would show up, do the job, spend their wages, keep the economy turning. A reliable worker was not supposed to ask, where is my money actually going? A reliable worker was supposed to earn, spend, and return on Monday. That is the system. You did not choose it. You were placed inside it before you were old enough to know it existed. So if you are sitting here tonight feeling like you work hard and have nothing to show for it, that is not a character flaw. That is the expected output of a system you were never taught to question. Research has found that financial stress reduces effective thinking ability by the equivalent of 13 IQ points. 13 points. That is not a small number. That is the difference between your sharpest self and a version of you that cannot think clearly about the very problem causing the stress. The system keeps you stressed. The stress keeps you reactive. The reactive choices keep you inside the system. That loop was not an accident. You were not given the wrong result. You were given the wrong map. You remember the first time you got a real paycheck, not the birthday money, not the summer job cash in an envelope, the real one, with your name on it, with the tax already taken out. You look at the number on the left, what you earned. You look at the number on the right, what arrived. And there is this moment. A quiet, slightly uncomfortable moment. Where is the rest of it? Nobody warned you about that gap. Nobody sat you down before your first job and said, this is what earned means and this is what kept means, and they are not the same number. You just opened the envelope, saw the number, felt something you could not name, and then you adapted. Because that is what people do. You adjusted your expectations to fit the number, not the other way around. That feeling, that first moment of quiet confusion, that was you sensing the gap for the very first time. You sensed it then. You are still sensing it now. The only difference is, today you are about to understand exactly what it is. Secret 1. Protect your thinking time like it is money. Nobody teaches you this. Not your parents, not your school, not your first manager who handed you a planner and a list of tasks. So if this feels new, that is not your fault. Here is the idea. Your ability to think clearly is a financial asset, not in a vague motivational way, in a very direct mechanical way. Every good financial decision you will ever make, every one, requires clear thinking, choosing what to do with a raise, deciding whether to take on debt, recognizing when someone is offering you a bad deal wrapped in good-sounding language. All of that requires your brain to be working well. Now here is what actually happens. By the time most people have time to think about their finances, it is 11 at night. They have been reacting to other people's emergencies since 8 in the morning. They are tired. Their thinking is slow. And the decision they make at 11 at night is not the same decision they would make at 7 in the morning before the world started demanding things from them. Your brain is sharpest early. Before the emails, before the noise, before other people's problems become your problems. He understood this. Warren Buffett did not take meetings in the morning. Not because he was unavailable. Because he treated his thinking time the same way he treated cash. Something finite. Something valuable. What does that mean practically? It means the financial decisions you make when you are exhausted will almost always cost you more than the ones you make with a clear head, something that disappears if you do not protect it. He read in the mornings. He thought in the mornings. He let the ideas sit and settle. What does that mean for you? It means the financial decisions you make when you are exhausted will almost always cost you more than the decisions you make when you are rested and clear. This is not about becoming a morning person. It is about knowing when you are at your sharpest and saving your most important choices for that window. Do not review your finances at midnight. Do not agree to anything financial when you are stressed. Do not sign, commit, or click confirm when your brain is running on empty. That protection, that single habit, is worth more than most people realize. The small action this week. Pick one financial decision you have been putting off. One. Not a system, not a plan. One decision. Schedule 15 minutes tomorrow morning before you check your phone to sit with it. That is the whole step. Secret 2. The contrast story. Marcus A.N.D. Daniel. This is the part most people need to hear, because this is where the abstract becomes real. Two men, same city, same year, same starting salary. Marcus and Daniel, both 24 years old, both earning $38,000 a year, both renting, both paying off a small student loan, both telling themselves they will start saving properly soon. Soon when things settle down. Soon when the loan is cleared. Soon when they get the next raise. That word soon is where their paths split. Not a dramatic moment. Not a crisis. Not a lottery win or a tragedy. One Tuesday afternoon, Daniel opens a video on his phone. Something about compound interest. He almost swipes past it. He watches it instead. He does not become obsessed. He does not quit his job and start a business. He does not do anything dramatic. He opens a separate savings account that same evening. Names it Future. Sets up an automatic transfer for $150 a month. That is it. $150. Before he can see it and spend it. Automatic, invisible, gone before it felt like his. Marcus does not watch the video. Marcus is not irresponsible. Marcus is not stupid. Marcus is tired like everyone, and the evening disappears into the usual things, and the Tuesday becomes Wednesday, and the idea of starting, properly starting, stays in the category of soon. 1 year passes. Daniel has $1,800 he has never touched. Marcus has roughly the same monthly balance he always has. Neither of them feels dramatically different. 3 years pass. Daniel has been earning more. So has Marcus. But Daniel increased the automatic transfer every time his salary went up. Not by much, just a small slice of every raise before he adjusted his lifestyle to the new number. He has now got just under $8,000 sitting separately. Marcus has a nicer car than he had 3 years ago, and a monthly payment to go with it. He is not struggling. But the number in his account at the end of each month looks almost identical to what it looked like 3 years ago. 5 years pass. Daniel has started moving money from the savings account into a simple investment vehicle as soon as the buffer felt comfortable. Nothing complicated. Just consistent. His money is working while he sleeps. Not dramatically, not getting rich overnight, just quietly compounding. Like a snowball rolling downhill, getting a little heavier every month, every year. The snowball does not feel heavy at first. It feels almost embarrassingly small. That is normal. The weight comes later. Marcus has had 2 raises. Both times he upgraded something. The flat, the car, the holiday. Each upgrade felt deserved. Each upgrade consumed the raise before it could become anything else. He is not failing. He is doing exactly what the system expects him to do. Earn more. Spend more. Stay at the same level. 10 years pass. Marcus and Daniel are both 34. Both still in the same city. Both earning good money now, Daniel slightly more, but not dramatically. Daniel's investment account sits at just over $62,000. Marcus has $4,100 in savings. Same starting point. Same city. Same decade. One decision. One Tuesday. $150. $62,000 versus $4,000. That gap was not built by talent. It was not built by a bigger salary. It was not built by taking huge risks. It was built by one invisible automatic habit, started so small it felt almost pointless, sustained long enough to become something real. If you are reading this and you feel like Daniel's story is not available to you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not behind because you are doing something wrong. You are behind because nobody showed you the Tuesday moment when it counted. Nobody pointed at the video and said, "Watch this one." Nobody set up the account for you. Nobody showed you that $150 a month, an amount that feels almost embarrassingly small, builds into something that changes the entire shape of your future. That is not your failure. That is the gap in what you were taught. Secret 3. Silence is a strategy. This one is uncomfortable for people because it goes against everything we have been trained to do. We share things now, we post things, we announce things, we tell our friends our plans. And when it comes to most areas of life, that is fine. But when it comes to money, talking about your plans is one of the most reliable ways to make sure they never happen. Not because your friends are bad people, because of something much more ordinary. When you tell someone your financial goal, your brain registers a small version of the reward before you have done anything. The telling feels like progress. It releases the same feeling as achieving. And that feeling, that small hit of satisfaction, quietly reduces the urgency to actually do the thing. But there is a second problem. The people around you have their own relationship with money. Most of them are inside the same system you are trying to step out of. And when you announce you are doing something different, spending less, saving more, saying no to things, the people inside the system will experience your decision as a small judgment of their own choices. They will not mean to talk you out of it. But they will. Don't be so serious about it. You only live once. It's just money. You've worked hard. Enjoy it. Every single one of those sentences sounds like kindness. Every single one of them pulls you back into the bucket with a hole in it. What does this mean for you? It means the plan stays quiet. The goal stays internal. The action is what matters, not the announcement. He understood this better than almost anyone. Warren Buffett did not call press conferences to announce his next move. He did not share his thinking while he was still thinking. He let the outcome speak, not because he was secretive, because he understood that the announcement changes the action. One thing you can do this week. Find one financial goal you have been telling people about and stop telling people about it. Just stop. Let it become something you do instead of something you say. Secret 4. The difference between price and cost. This is one of the most important ideas in this video, and almost nobody explains it properly. So if this is new to you, that is completely normal. Price is the number on the label, cost is what it actually takes from you. They are not the same number. A $20 item bought on a credit card and paid off slowly over 6 months with interest does not cost $20. It costs $20 plus the interest, plus the mental load of the balance sitting on the card, plus the reduced ability to respond when something unexpected happens. The price said $20. The cost was higher, much higher. But the price is on the label. The cost is invisible. And we are trained from birth to look at the label. Supermarkets know this. Car dealerships know this. Credit card companies know this. Nobody puts the real cost on the label, because if they did, fewer people would buy. He saw price and cost as two entirely different things. A cheap business with expensive problems cost more than a great business at a high price. He said in documented interviews and letters that it is far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. That is not just about stocks. That is a way of seeing the world. Every time you are about to make a financial decision, ask 2 questions. What is the price? And what is the real cost? The real cost includes time. The real cost includes stress. The real cost includes what you cannot do, because this money is now spoken for. That second question, the cost question, is the one that changes decisions. Secret 5. Money needs a job or it disappears. This one sounds simple. It is not. Money sitting in a current account doing nothing is not neutral. It is losing. How much is it losing? Over 10 years, money sitting still loses roughly a third of what it can buy. The number stays the same. The world around it gets more expensive. That gap is invisible. But it is real. Inflation is silent. You do not feel it day to day. But it is working constantly, like a very slow, very patient thief who never takes much at once. Over 10 years, money that is not growing is worth significantly less than it was on day one. The number in the account stays the same, but what that number can buy gets smaller every single year. So idle money is not safe money. This is the thing most people were never told. They were told, save your money. They were not told, saved money needs somewhere to go or the saving is an illusion. He understood this from a very early age. Money had to be working, doing something, generating something, even when the amounts were small. He was not waiting to invest until he had enough to invest. He invested whatever he had, because he understood that idle money has a cost even when it looks like it is sitting safely still. What does this mean for you right now? It does not mean you need a complicated plan today. It means you need to ask, of every pound or dollar sitting in your account, what is this money's job? Is it the buffer, the emergency fund, the investment seed? Give it a job. Name it. Direct it. Money with a name and a job is harder to spend on nothing. Money with no name and no job disappears before you understand where it went. 3 steps. In order. Start with step 1. Do not skip to step 3 because it sounds more impressive. Step 1 is where the change actually begins. Step 1. The name game. This week, open a separate account today. One account. Name it something specific, not savings, something that means something to you. Future, buffer, freedom, first step. Whatever word makes you feel something when you see it. Then, and this is the whole step, set up one automatic transfer. It does not have to be large. It has to be automatic. Before you can see it and spend it. $50, $100, whatever number feels slightly uncomfortable but not impossible. That discomfort is important. It means it is real. Do this today, not tomorrow. Why not tomorrow? Because tomorrow has its own reasons. To wait. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes the version of soon. That never arrives. Today is the only day that is actually available, not when things settle down. Things do not settle down. You make the move before they do. That account, that one automatic number, is the foundation everything else sits on. Step 2, the audit. This month, pull up the last 3 months of your bank statements. Do not judge what you see. Just look. Find the things leaving your account that you forgot were leaving. The subscription you meant to cancel. The membership you use twice a year. the service that doubled in price 6 months ago and you did not notice. This is not about becoming cheap. It is about becoming conscious. Every pound or dollar that leaves without your awareness is a pound or dollar that cannot do a job. Cancel 2 things. Just 2. Take the money those 2 things were using and redirect it to the account you named in step 1. Now the leak is patched. Now that water stays in the bucket. Step 3. The long game. This year. This step requires nothing from you today, but it asks you to make one decision. Decide that the next raise you receive, any raise, any bonus, any unexpected money, will not be fully absorbed by a lifestyle upgrade. Just decide it now, before the money arrives. The decision made before the money arrives is a completely different decision to the one made after the money is in your account and the car dealership is on the phone and the holiday looks very reasonable this year. Pre-decide. When the money comes, some goes to the account you named. Not all of it. Some. A percentage. A slice. The rest of your life stays the same. This is how the gap closes. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But steadily. Unstoppably. Like a river carving rock. Not fast. But always moving. Always in one direction. And direction, held long enough, becomes distance. Picture yourself at 82. Sitting somewhere quiet, looking back. You are not thinking about the big moments, the promotions, the dramatic decisions. You are thinking about the ordinary Tuesdays, the Tuesday you opened that account, the Tuesday you sat with something quietly instead of spending it, the Tuesday you decided not to announce the plan, just to work it. The ordinary Tuesdays built everything, not the dramatic moments, the quiet ones, the ones nobody saw, the ones you almost skipped because you were tired and it did not feel like it mattered yet. It mattered. Every single one of them mattered. And sitting there at 82, you will not wish you had waited longer to start. You will not wish you had needed less courage. You will feel something very simple and very clear. That you were always capable of this. The plan did not need to be perfect. It did not need to be large. It did not need to impress anyone. It just needed to be started. And then continued. On the Tuesdays when it felt pointless. On the months when nothing seemed to be changing, on the days when the gap between where you were and where you wanted to be felt too wide to cross, you crossed it anyway, one ordinary day at a time. That is the whole story. That was always the whole story. That the path was never as complicated as it looked from the outside. That all it ever required was a decision, held quietly, repeated on ordinary days long enough to become a life. The door has always been open. Most people just never believed they were allowed to walk through it.